All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Today we are joined by Oxford University professor and founding director of the Oxford Martin School, Ian Goldin. Previously, Ian was economic advisor to President Mandela and then vice president and policy head for the World Bank. He is the author of 22 books, including The Butterfly Defect and Terra, Incognita. In today's live stream, Ian will trace the paths of peoples, cities, wars, climates, and technologies, all on a global scale. It is my pleasure to welcome Ian Goldin.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thanks to all of you for joining. I know people are on different time zones around the world, so good morning, good evening to you. And it's a huge pleasure to be able to chat today about our book, Terra Incognita, which is being launched tomorrow. And I know joining as well in this conference is my co-author of the book, Rob Mugger, who's been with me from the very start on this, what is really been a very large effort to produce a book which we feel really helps shape the way we think about the future. Rob and I have been working for a number of years now together with a group at the Carnegie Mellon University in the US, who are specialists in map making. And what we hope the book produces is perspectives that help guide you as you think about the future. These are not maps that predict the future or can give with any accuracy the future. That would be clearly impossible. But what we hope to do is provide perspectives on the past and the present on key topics, which we think by understanding, we'll be able to have and navigate a much safer, a more resilient, a more inclusive future of shared prosperity. And that's really the aim of the book, is to use this as a tool to think about the drivers of change, the forces that are shaping us, and how we may move to the future. The book is incredibly wide-ranging. It's comprehensive in the topics. Obviously, we can't talk about everything, but we try and focus on key issues that we feel we are experts in, that we have some comparative advantage in talking about. Rob is an expert on violence, on geopolitics, on cities. He's been based in Brazil, in Rio. And I've been working for much of my life on big issues around globalization, demography, migration, food systems, and others. And so what we do is cover a range of issues, providing what we think is the state of the art in ways of thinking about it through maps. And we hope that gives you a different perspective. We've listed 100 maps that are our maps to survive the future. And as you can see, they cover a very wide range of different areas. The breadth and depth of this is really testimony to what's been able to be produced using satellite imagery and new technologies in map making. But map making is an ancient art, and it's always been something for tens of thousands of years, since the early cave dwellings. We know that people drew maps to make sense of their environment, to gain perspective, and to explain to each other how they fitted into the world, their place in the world related to others. Of course, as we know from ancient map making, maps are not fixed objects, and they always reflect the perspectives and biases of the map makers, the technologies, and we see that evolution over time, as I've also shown in my book, Age of Discovery, where we totally revolutionized map making from being a flat earth with dragons on the edges to total circumnavigation. And now, of course, we can go much further. With satellite imagery, we, for the first time, can really look at the world, and we can even look back. The book was written before COVID-19 hit us, but I think all of us have been totally absorbed in the maps which have been coming out on the spread of the novel coronavirus. what Johns Hopkins University has produced and what others of this little sense of what's coming from China and then spreading rapidly around the world has affected all our lives. And this, of course, is incomplete because we don't know what this will look like in a year or two's time. But what it's taught us is the importance of place, the importance of understanding others. And I think there's never been a time when people have been more transfixed by maps. With this coronavirus, a graphic display, not only at the global level, but also at the subnational level, the different states of the US and their very variable incidence of coronavirus, for example, showing just how important this sense of perspective is. What we've done with the book is go through a whole series of different topics and try and produce maps which depict the state we're in and what we need to think about. The maps on globalization reflect our hyper interconnectivity. This is simply an image at the beginning of the map, of the maps of globalization, of the different levels of connected fiber optic cables, roads, rail, and other systems which connect countries around Asia and Europe. And we've done that for different types of the world. We think these cross-border flows are what define globalization and the changes over time. And they've been an immensely powerful force for good, lifting billions of people out of poverty around the world. They've spread opportunities and ideas, and most recently we've seen that with the spread of the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Me Too movement, which we trace in the book, as well as other ideas which, like democracy, which have changed our lives. And globalization certainly isn't dead, but it's being transformed and it's under threat, and we show that too. The different ways we connect are depicted in the book, and this is an image of our connected world with cell phones and mobile connectivity, with the purple line showing submarine cables and the white, the intensity. And what you see is the very uneven connectedness. Obviously the Arctic regions, far north, but then also the center of Africa and the center of Australia, deserts, but also lack of infrastructure. Many of these maps we use draw on the Earth Times imagery over time, and you get this sort of dynamic effect where you can see the movements. Each of these dots represents $10 million of manufactured trade. And what you see in this reflection of time over time is just how engaged different parts of the world become. And particularly you see with NAFTA, Mexico engaging with Canada and the US, and then Asia and particularly China becoming much more important. Now the book has snapshots which depict all of these images, showing over time from before and after what happens to different places. Globalization is about all flows. It's about the flows of money, but also the flows of ideas, the flows of goods, and the flows of bad things like pandemics. And we depict that. One of the very good flows is the flows of aid, which we depict in the book. And you see with this image how this has evolved very rapidly, and increasingly also new donors emerging, like, for example, the flows coming out increasingly of China and out of the Gulf region of the Middle East. Not all flows, as we've said, are good, and this is an image that we have in the book of plastic waste, and we have others like this which show and highlight some of the very bad things. It also emphasizes what can be done about it. What's striking, if you're done the map that is of a much earlier period, has vast quantities of plastics on the Mediterranean shore of Spain and Italy, and that now has gone as the cleanup has begun, and we see this very rapid accumulation around Asia, particularly China, South Asia Sea, and of course worrying accumulations in West Africa and elsewhere. The climate chapter, and this is an area that both Rob and I are absolutely passionate about, really is able to use the latest image to show how rapidly advancing. And I'm only providing in this presentation a snapshot of what we have in the book, which has many, many, many more maps and images that I'm depicting here. This is an image of the Amazon and depicts deforestation on a very, very rapid scale, which is obviously one of the big challenges we face, stopping deforestation. This time lapse, and we have the different images of before and after in the book, shows how farms have taken over the Amazon with the slashing and burning of trees. Both Rob and I have traveled to the Himalayas and taken photographs there, as I have done to the Arctic and Antarctic. And what you see here is the disappearance of the glaciers, 1984 and 2019. And this is really what one could consider to be a third pole of the world, the very, very significant amounts of water stored in these glaciers. Just in this area, we're seeing something like 4,600 square miles of fresh water that's stored. The disappearance of this has dramatic consequences for over 2 billion people living on the floodplains and the downstream areas of India, South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and of course, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Laos, Cambodia, and elsewhere. So this has dramatic consequences on food and food security. Other images we've shown, these are satellite images, are of the fires of recent years. And this is burning Arctic fires in the Northwest Territories of Canada, taken from satellites. The Kangerlussuaq ice melt is another dramatic representation in Greenland of the advance of climate change. We show in our images the contrast of time past with the present, and this is a very, very scary scene where you see this rapid warming of the Earth, where average temperatures change in rather dramatic ways over time. It's this average warming which obviously reflects massive, massive disparities behind it, because farmers and people don't care about averages, they care about extremes. And behind this, of course, is the dramatic impact on many other dimensions. So we're moving to a world where, unless we do something about it, we're seeing many parts of the world affected by 4 or 5 degrees increase in temperature, depending on the time of year. And that clearly will lead to catastrophic climate change. Who is producing these greenhouse gases is also changing very, very rapidly. We need to worry about the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but it's the flows that we can control. And this rise of China is very dramatic in these images, and other countries. So China now, the biggest emitter, and one, of course, which is doing the most about it as well. Greenhouse gases are one aspect of pollution, but there are many others. And one of the images that really struck me and surprised me dramatically that Rob was able to get for the book is this contrast between the number of deaths we have from air pollution versus homicide, murder. And you see that virtually everywhere in the world, that violence is a much bigger threat and murder than pollution is. But pollution is gaining in significance, and in some places, like in South Africa, like in the Caribbean and Mexico, Central America, we see that violence is overtaking pollution as the biggest threat to humanity. What we show in these animations as well is the fires at night that are affecting. Of course, depending on the seasons, there are different places that are particularly affected by fire, but these graphic images taken by satellites of fires at night are an extraordinary wake-up call to the extent of devastation that's happening around the world. And of course, we know that now in California, as we speak, the ability to control a fire is under threat. What to do with deforestation and how to stop this destruction of the Amazon and other forests around the world is something that we are looking at in the book in a variety of different ways, and including in the food. Now, unless we do something dramatically about climate, we've also project what is likely to happen to major cities around the world. And what you see here is Florida and Miami disappearing with under 2-degree increase in temperatures. So this is an existential threat for many cities, and we depict these cities. These are the images we show for Miami in 2050, but we do this for different places as well, like Jakarta and like Rotterdam and Holland, which already is dramatically under sea level. But the amount of investment that would have to be done in the Netherlands to cope with this, we believe, is much, much greater than anything that has ever happened historically. Urbanization is another trend we look at in the book, and we look the speed of urbanization characterizes our modern time. Many of the most rapidly growing cities, as we show, are coastal, and they will be dramatically affected, like Mumbai, Miami, Jakarta, Dakar, and others, by ocean rise, which we believe will be about 1 meter at least this century if climate change is contained to 2 degrees. But cities are growing everywhere, and including in the desert, and this is Las Vegas, and I think some friends of mine are indeed calling in this call from Las Vegas, and you see the spread of the sprawl there, pumping water from deeper and further. And this illustrates a very important point, that if you're rich enough, you can escape climate change, but it's only the rich that will really be able to do that, because the poor will literally be washed away or starved. When we think about the future and how to survive the future, technology is going to have a vital role to play. And it also is transforming, of course, in dramatic ways, the present, not least the present in terms of technologies in health and the threat to work that automation and AI pose. And in our technology chapter, we look at many of these different trends. This is an image that we've devised in my group which works on technological and economic change in the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University. And what we're showing here is patents and where they're being developed, which is really a reflection upstream of where technology is coming from. Well, they're not making technologies in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, as is depicted in this image, but that reflects collaboration, as do these streams of patents across North Africa between China and the US. And what the current patent and technology wars that are brewing between the US and China threaten is this collaboration, which we believe is at the heart of change and of technology. Deep learning research is something we can map over time, and that's, of course, driving the frontiers. And what we see here is, starting in Taiwan, how it is growing rapidly around the world, how this has become a global enterprise, and of course dominated by wealthier countries, but not only, increasingly. And these are the future pointers to where technology is coming from and how it's likely to evolve. Where technology is going to go to is also a concern of ours, and including the use of technologies to solve our biggest problems, not least those of power in a carbon-free world. What we see is the rapid growth, which is very inspiring, of wind power and solar power. China now the biggest producer of both, overtaking the US. And of course, when we drill down, as we do in the book, we see that the regulatory environment in different US states dramatically impacts on the ability of countries to adopt these technologies. In the Oxford Martin School, we have a group working on the future of work. We've come up with rather large numbers in terms of the amount of people that are threatened. We think about half the people in the US are threatened by automation. You see that here in the light green color over the US. And even bigger amounts in China. We think 55% of people are threatened by automation. We discuss this threat. It's not going to say it's going to happen. The question is, what does one do about it? How does one think about it? And what is the future of development in that world? We do think that these different forces of COVID, of the pandemic, of climate change, and of technology, unless more effectively managed, will lead to widening inequality. And we devote in the chapter on inequality a lot of time to thinking about what is happening with inequality, why is it increasing, and what can be done about it. One of the ways to show inequality is to look at lights at night. And just comparing, for example, Lagos with New York, same populations, and you see this intensity difference in the light. Cities of about 15 million people, with Lagos maybe 10% of the luminosity, not only of New York, but the Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, Northeast area of the US. There are many ways to get this sense of the inequalities that are emerging. And the fact is that most of this inequality is about the top 10%, and within that, the top 1,000th of percent. You see the soaring inequality of particularly the top. Just in the last months with COVID-19, of course, Jeff Bezos has become even richer, and we've seen the soaring in valuations of some of the technology entrepreneurs and companies. Pre-tax inequality is worse than post-tax because there is some redistribution, but this makes absolutely no difference to the higher levels of inequality that we see here. So we believe something needs to be done urgently about this, and we discuss what. One of the reasons, of course, has been the stagnation of wages, and this is a very graphic illustration of that. The red line shows increasing US aggregate output, or GDP, the size of the US economy, and the blue line, the stagnation in wages, which has been going on now for over 50 years. It was made worse by the financial crisis, but this is a long-term trend, and of course, restoring the ability of ordinary people to earn income and for the incomes to increase in line with national economic activity is part of the challenge that we discuss. Now, rising inequality is leading to increasingly fractured politics. And in the chapter on geopolitics, we discuss both why the global order of the last 75 years is ending, and this is something that Rob has been doing a lot of work on, and why there's increasing populism and nationalism within countries, and what's behind this, and of course, importantly, what can be done about it. We show that one shouldn't be too despondent about democracy. It has been increasing, not least if we take the longer view, as we do from 1980s to the present. But a lot of what we call democracies are not, in fact, democracies. They're what we would term anocracies, autocratic democracies, including now Brazil, Russia, and a number of other countries. And it's that which we think also provides a real threat to what's happening. There's been much progress. We see in Latin America democracy spreading. We see it in Africa too, and across Europe, but much more needs to be done in this respect. Violence is another area that Rob has been particularly focused on, and our chapter on violence has many illustrations of where violence is and what can be done about it. The difference in different forms of violence, wars, conflicts, armed gangs, why it arises, and the dramatic localization of this in particular suburbs, in particular areas within cities, so that neighboring suburbs have vastly different levels of violence. We discuss why that is. We show in using maps why it is. Now, incarceration rates, of course, are also vastly different, although we do not believe that they are an answer to the problem. Indeed, we believe they are part of the problem. Here you see in the US, for example, over 500 people per 100,000 incarcerated, as is the case in Thailand, and in very few other places like the US, and unenviable to be in that particular club of high incarceration. But a very different outlook and no relationship between incarceration and crime, indeed an inverse one. We track the movement of illegal commodities and show how this is the underbelly of globalization. Often 10% of flows, whatever these flows are these illicit flows. And so the question is, how do you have more effective movement of people, of goods, of services, ideas without more illicit flows? And illicit flows on the internet as well, in terms of fake news and other bad things which are happening in those flows. The demographic shapers are dramatic in the world, and we go into these. Over 3.8 billion people, that's about half the world's population, we show, live inside this little circle of a small, relatively small part of the world. The Chinese population, we show, has peaked, and there's been a dramatic change in fertility. Most people think the problem is too many people, but what we show in the book is actually over half the countries of the world now have way below replacement levels. And there are very few countries that are left that have the levels of fertility that people imagine, which is over 5. Indeed, most of Africa is coming down dramatically, and large parts of Latin America and Asia are already below replacement levels. That means we have very different shapes of our societies. We see countries moving from the sort of classic pyramid shape of Nigeria to this more ice cream cone type of shape of Korea, or spinning top, through as well a coffin type shape of the United States. This has dramatic implications and places enormous pressures on young people, which we discuss. It will also change the nature of finance going forward, of course, because pensions will be unaffordable, people will work longer, and there's massive gender imbalances. Women are wiser than men, and so they live longer. They don't make as many stupid decisions, like drinking as much, smoking as much, and sticking as many knives into each other. And that gender imbalance will become particularly acute as a driver as well of change. Now, migration is another area where we think we can prick some of the fallacies. In demography, the fallacy is too many people. In migration is that there are too many migrants. And we think this is not the case. But we show where the migrants are, and they're really in these corridors. Each dot here represents over 1,000 migrants. And what we show is that the particular corridors, and these are not mainly anymore to the rich countries. Indeed, there are far more migrants within Africa, for example, or within Asia than there are between these regions and the rich countries. The migration lends itself to a lot of animations. You see the movement over time of migrants to particular regions, and we chart these in the book and show how the sources and destinations are changing in rather dramatic ways. This is to Europe, and we show the widening sources, but how this is like also changing with much more migration within Europe now than ever was. And of course, the UK dropping dramatically, as is the US in terms of destinations. So these snapshots of migration also reflect where most people are going to and where most people are coming from. And again, so many myths around this, and most of the migrations within the regions. Also, a very strong migration from South Asia to the Middle East and North Africa. Each of these dots reflects a refugee, and we see this dramatic change in refugees over time. The US no longer welcoming, the source of the refugees also changing dramatically over time. And that, of course, is something which is not respected or understood much today. So we hope that these images will change some of the myths around refugees and also reflect the drama of, for example, these impulses that come when particular places go through crisis. First Turkey, massive migrations, then, as we'll see here, an explosion of migrants, of refugees from Syria. In this case, each of these dots reflects 17 refugees coming out, and that from Iraq and then Syria. Most going, as is shown here, to neighboring countries. And it's that, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, who are absorbing. And most of the refugees from Somalia, from Sudan, similarly are going to neighboring countries, not least to Kenya and to Uganda, as we see in this image of migration from Somalia and Sudan, of refugees. So these refugee charts are dramatic. We also show in these animations the changes in trade in food. And this is, of course, related to deforestation. Over 90% of palm oil comes from two countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. And you see that palm oil trade depicted here, the dramatic increases in it over time. The trade within Europe and in North America is between processors, basically. It gets imported into one place, processed by companies like Unilever, and then re-exported within them. Live animals are also a very active area of trade globally, and you see this dramatic change, and particularly note how China becomes more and more important as an importer from Latin America and elsewhere, and the trade within Europe benefiting from the European Union. The nutritional deficiencies that are the other side of this trade are also changing where they are and the number of lives that are lost. And what you see here is this nutritional deficiency, the growth of people who don't have what they need, particularly projected in Africa. The bovine meat trade, we believe, is one that's going to have to change dramatically going forward. People are going to have to eat less meat as part of the challenge to meeting our climate change objectives. And this reflects which countries are likely to be affected globally. Again, you'll see a lot of trade within Europe, from Latin America to North America and to Europe, from Australia, and increasing China involved in this. We look at not only animal production on Earth, but also aquaculture. And what you see here is that basically there's no more fresh fish available, that increasing production is going to be from aquaculture. And the growth of aquaculture is mainly an Asian phenomenon. You see this extraordinary increase in the millions of tons produced from China in fish farming. We focus on health. Life expectancy is the most important thing for everyone. We talk about COVID and the impact of that on this, but we've seen this wonderful good news story of rising life expectancy. Yellow is under 55 years. The blues and purples are over 75. And you see that there are very few places left where life expectancy is under 55 years. And this wonderful improvement in life expectancy within many places now, well over 80, that's the dark blue moving towards the purple. A wonderful story to tell, which is the other side of the fertility story. And this in large part relates to nutrition, which we've discussed, and also to education. We know that girls' education particularly is highly correlated with child health and with adult health. The story on education is an encouraging one, not least when it comes to literacy. And we show in many maps and graphs how this has improved and how there's a converging improvement in this. But still many laggards, countries in Africa and some others like India, where the years of schooling still are way below what they are in other parts of the world. And so much progress, as we highlight, needs to be made, and still some places, although fewer and fewer, that's depicted in blue, and you see the disappearance of that, are projected to have no formal education. The internet is extremely important, the growth of the internet, still a massive digital divide, and our maps show where the digital divide is and the levels of connectivity. Culture is an often neglected aspect of globalization, and it defines our politics, the way we think about each other. It's the glue holding our societies together, and we tackle it from a variety of different aspects. There are many good things and there are many bad things about it. And one of the things we celebrate is the global spread, not least in the US, across all US states, of same-sex marriages. A dramatic story which is linked to globalization, over 42 countries in the world now allowing this. We look at the spread of soft power, the politics which is related to this, and how this shapes politics, economics, and behavior. So we try to provide not only scientific perspectives, like those on climate change, but also ones that reflect on politics and the way we think about places. In the conclusion of the book, we bring all these different aspects together and ask what is the story we are telling and how it impacts on the world, and what can we do about it? How do we gain perspective from these images to create a better world? The fires that were ravaging across Australia as we were writing the conclusions helped us concentrate our minds, as did COVID-19, which we talk about in the front and end of the book. It's a wake-up call to all of us. It shows that business as usual is not going to give us a healthy, sustainable world. It shows us that when we bounce back, we need to do something more. We need to bounce forward. We need to create a world which is totally different to the world before COVID-19. What's been shown by the fact that what's acceptable now was totally unacceptable in January of this year is that we can change our behavior to stop climate change, to stop the spread of pandemics. We can change our economic policies, as we're doing dramatically. We can change our rules and regulations, and we need to do much more of this. One of the iconic images that we reflect on in the book is this blue marble, which has been so well documented by satellites and by lunar and other missions. And this extraordinary complexity, fragility, and opportunity that we have at this dramatic time as we begin to think about a world after COVID-19, of a better world. Terra Incognita was always a term used for the unknown world, and there's a much that remains unknown, but there's much that is known, and we can shape our destiny. Now we've written this book and we're launching it tomorrow at a time which is difficult. We can't do our normal events, so we're doing online events, which are wonderful. People can't go to bookshops, so they're increasingly having to order online. And we're relying more and more on word of mouth to spread the news about this book, because people won't be seeing it. It's a big and handsome book. It's one that we hope, through its beautiful presentation by Penguin, will be able to be something which is a reference going forward. And we've been absolutely delighted by the wonderfully generous reviews that some people have already provided that have had the book. Martin Rees saying that it would be his Desert Island Disc certainly made my day. And of course, Stephen Fry and the many others that have endorsed this. I think what's important for us as well is that it's read by people of all ages, because people my age certainly are not going to be around in 100 years, but young people certainly should and could be, if we have a world that's a sane and safe world. What we're doing through this virtual process of launching is hoping to inspire a conversation, and Rob and I are on Twitter, where we would love to continue that. So what we're going to do now in the remaining 20 minutes is open to your discussion, to your comments. We very much hope that you enjoy the book. We look forward to your comments. We hope it's going to go into a second printing soon. So if you find any errors, don't hesitate to let me know through the website or elsewhere. And we certainly hope that you find, as we have in writing it and presenting it, that some of the things we thought about, we change our mind about, that it helps us gain clarity, and that it helps us in this time which is immensely pressured, confusing, different, to gain perspective, an optimistic perspective that allows us to see the challenges, but the progress that's been made, and the possibilities to overcome these challenges and create a better, more resilient, more inclusive world for all of us and for the next generation. Thank you very much. I will now stop the share and we can go back to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that incredible talk and such incredible graphics. I would like to invite everyone with us to submit their questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I see we have a couple already, and we will try and get through as many as we can. So why don't we start with the first one from Timur. Do you see large swathes of the population living around the equator moving to the northern or southern hemispheres due in part to climate change and water scarcity?
Yeah, I don't see them moving to the northern hemispheres because the evidence that we've seen from all previous crises is that the desperately poor people, particularly in the tropics, tend to move to neighboring countries. They'll move inland. Some members of the family, often the oldest son or daughter, might move to try and become breadwinners. But I think what we'll see is an acceleration of urbanization as the lands become more fragile. Increasingly, the urban places which will be more viable will be the ones that aren't coastal, because those will be inundated and there'll be saline encroachment coming into water supplies. Some people will go, but as we see now, and we map in the book, 95% of the migrants and refugees in Africa stay in Africa. So yes, there will be some pressure, I think, on the north, but I don't see or envisage the sort of hordes of people imagery that people have as a threat in the short term or to medium term. Of course, in the longer term, people will move increasingly, and I think that is the case over time. A third of the children being born in the world today are being born in Africa. It's the only young continent left. And so clearly the pressures building there on development are enormous. And if we're going to meet the challenge of development, we're going to have to meet them fully in Africa.
Matt asks, what changes would you envisage with global population set to decline from about mid-century?
Well, there's going to be changes in all dimensions. The politics change in the rich democracies, particularly because the elderly become a bigger and bigger share of the vote, and therefore they will be wanting to keep their pensions. That means they'll be pushing up taxes for young people. I think they'll also be removing retirement ages. So I think it changes the balance of power between the young and the old. And that's very significant everywhere except in Africa, really, where the young remain dominant for a much longer time. I think we will see asset distribution. So the elderly also get wealthier relative to the young. They'll hold on to their money. The children will inherit their parents' houses if they're lucky enough to have parents that have houses that they can inherit when they're 70 and their parents are in their 90s. So they'll be in their 60s or 70s. And their parents will also have to hold on to their money for their health and other needs. So I think young people will need to have jobs much longer. I think the sort of parents looking after kids idea is going to become a more fragile idea. And I think what we will also see is this gender imbalance. So there will also, I think, and we're seeing this in COVID-19 accelerated, I think we're increasingly going to see dynamic cities being increasingly young and older people moving out of the cities. So we'll see cities becoming younger, more dynamic, more productive, basically supporting bigger countrysides of more older people.
Thank you. Edward asks, can you talk some more about the rising protectionism and the reduction of globalization?
Rising protectionism is a huge concern, and good to see you, Ed. We've met before. And I think it needs to be thought about in various ways. The first is, and I argued this in an op-ed in the Financial Times today. The first is that the center of gravity of globalization is moving to Asia, particularly to East Asia, rather dramatically. And the US and UK are shooting themselves in both feet in accelerating this, both the US on the health and the economic front. And in some senses, the UK is doing the same on both fronts as well. And Asia is very pro-globalization. So what you think about globalization and protectionism depends very much on where you stand and are looking at it from. And I think when you look at it from an Asian perspective, protectionism is not rising in that region. It's rising particularly in the US, to a lesser extent in Europe, I would say. So it's not clear to me there is rising protectionism, but there's certainly a Cold War 2.0 brewing between the US and China, which is a very worrying aspect. The second is that a growing size of globalization is not about manufactured goods and products. These increasingly will be done by automated systems, 3D printing, robotics, and others, which will be produced in the rich countries, not only in manufacturing of everything, including shirts like this, which can be made by a machine, but also in services. So call centers, back offices of banks, of insurance firms, increasingly in the cloud, automated, or in servers in the basement of a headquarters building in a rich country or in China. And so that international division of labor, I think, is something which is going to be fundamentally changed, accelerated by COVID. Protectionism is not happening in ideas to the same extent. There are places and firewalls, of course, but what we're seeing, not least in the fight against COVID, is unprecedented collaboration, and we need it, particularly to stop nationalism on vaccines, which would be devastating, not least for poor countries. So I hope we're not going to get health nationalism, although there's a real risk of that we're seeing. It's being fought, I think, quite effectively. And in Oxford, we're producing a vaccine. We're insisting that it's open source and available to everyone. So protectionism is rising. I do not, as I argued in the FT, see it as ending globalization. I see it accelerating the marginalization as the leading globalization power of the US, and that globalization will have increasingly Chinese characteristics and Asian characteristics and other aspects of globalization, ideas globalization, financial globalization, health globalization. I think we'll see recovering. Business travel permanently down because we've realized the efficiencies and cost savings and carbon savings of remote connectivity, but tourism, I think, will rebound. So I'm not seeing globalization fundamentally challenged by COVID-19 or by protectionism. It's going to be transformed and accelerated transformed, but we do need to guard against it. And I think your question is one which we all need to be very concerned about, because the end of globalization would lead to a very dangerous world. It would accelerate the risks, not least climate change and pandemics. And of course, it would leave billions of people around the world that are in poverty for much longer.
Karen asks, what can you tell us on the increasing consumption of energy and how it will impact climate change?
There's COVID-19 has sort of made a short-term blip in this, but as Rob has argued in a recent op-ed, and I absolutely agree with him, it's not healing the planet. Energy consumption is rising. We need it to rise. There's still 700 million people in Africa that don't have access to reliable energy. And so for development reasons, we need to see energy made available to all. Of course, it's very unevenly distributed, as we saw in those images of the lights of Lagos and New York. New York State consumes more energy than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, these are huge inequities in energy consumption, production, and distribution. But we need energy. It's going to have to be clean energy. We have to dramatically remove our dependence on fossil fuels and cut other carbon emitters, including and greenhouse gas emitters, including bovine, in that respect. So we're going to need to move to clean energy. We know how to do it. It's already cheaper than fossil fuels in many, many places. It needs to be further subsidized. It needs to be encouraged. We need carbon taxes to reflect the true costs of carbon. But we're going to need to accelerate that transition. And in the book, we show using maps how the regulatory environment and how other changes can lead to that, and where energy demand is, where it has to go. And I hope you find those maps and images of use as you think about that.
Speaking of maps, Christine asks, are there any maps showing changes in trading patterns following the UK decision to leave the EU?
We haven't yet picked that up because, of course, the EU hasn't yet, in terms of trade, left the EU. That's going to, I think, happen at the end of this year, where everything changes and we have the Big Bang. So that hasn't yet been seen, but certainly we will pick it up when we go forward for future editions, using those sorts of trade flows that we have. What we do pick up from in the book is how changes in policy in the EU have led to changes of trade within the EU, between the UK and the EU, something like 50% of UK trade with the EU, something like 8% of EU trade with the UK. So it's a very asymmetric relation, which is why we need them much more than they need us. And we've shown that with NAFTA as well, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, how this changes trade arrangements, but not yet Brexit.
Another question from Timur on automation. What risk does it pose? Has COVID tested some of the potential solutions? And what does this mean for the most vulnerable?
Automation, I think, is an underestimated threat. It's also an opportunity, and obviously the way that we've been able to do remote things is a testament to some of the successes. Some of the disasters of automation include the UK's A-level exam fiasco. That was not a mutant AI, as the Prime Minister suggested. There's no such thing as a mutant AI. That's programming. That's people who wrote the algorithm. They designed it. There's no mutant AI. But the potential is growing enormously rapidly, and we of the view, and we at the high end of estimates on this, others like the OECD, McKinsey Global Institute have much lower numbers, but we believe this will fundamentally change the nature of work around the world in the coming decades. We believe it already is in process, and my BBC series, Will AI Kill Development? I interviewed a whole lot of people about this and became even more convinced that this is the case. This poses a fundamental question for development, because the middle rungs of the development ladder have always been people doing repetitive, low-skilled work. And if you take that away, this sort of production line work, and it's not only in manufacturing, it's also call centers and services. What is the work for 10 million people coming onto the labor market in Africa every year for the next 10 years? So we believe it is a vital issue. We're working on it. In the book, we harvest some of the findings of the work in the Oxford Martin School around this to talk about what things that can be done. There's massive potential, and there needs to be a massive increase in investment in education around this, as well as the recognition of the tax environment, the safety net environment becoming more and more important. And this has a direct political implication. We also show that, for example, people were more likely to vote for Trump that were more vulnerable to automation. This is political. And the same in the UK, where people who are more vulnerable to automation were more likely to vote for Brexit. They have the wrong political response, in my view, but it is the sense of insecurity and indeed of being threatened. And so we need to think about this very deeply and how we create a world where we have employment and prosperity that is more shared in a world of automation. And the book talks about that, and it's certainly at the center of our attention in my research group in Oxford.
Thank you. Kayla asks, what is the most urgent connection between urbanization and climate change?
The majority of the world's emissions are coming from urban areas, and that increasingly will be the case as a growing share of the world's economic activity and population are in urban areas. So what cities do about climate change is of fundamental importance. We also see, and Rob is very involved in this, these alliances of cities coming together, acting even when the federal governments won't allow, as is the case in the US with New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and others, where cities can do an enormous amount of creating cleaner environments, reducing fossil emissions in their cities by their choices, retrofitting buildings, pedestrianization, cycling, good for health, good for climate change, etc. So cities are very much at the center of this. And as we argue in the chapter on urbanization, the future of cities is intertwined with how we move to a cleaner, non-carbon world. So it's absolutely central.
Karen asks, in regards to your book, with all the material available, what were the main challenges when you wrote the conclusions?
That's a good question. The main challenge we faced was that, the world is changing pretty rapidly, and as we had COVID on top of us, we had new fires emerging, new evidence and so we were thinking as we went through and reviewed all the chapters, is this all up to date? And it was, fortunately, because these fundamental drivers of change remain, and we introduced COVID. And then how to synthesize, and what we wanted in the conclusion, and I hope when you read it, you'll feel we were able to achieve this, is a balance of, okay, now we know what the issues are, we've shown them, we've given perspective, what can we do about it? How can we learn from this and go forward in a positive frame of mind? Whoever we are reading this book, whether we're a scholar, whether we're a leader, whether we're a business person, whatever our place in the world, how can we use this as a toolbox to help us fix some of the problems in the world? And if we each fixed one little problem, the world would be a much better place and we'd be a lot happier for it.
I think coming to the end of this, as our last question, an attendee asks, of all the maps you've produced, which one gives you the greatest hope for the future?
It's like asking which is your favorite child. It's a very difficult question. We feel so attached to these many, many maps. But I think the ones that give me a real hope are some of these maps, for example, of the Amazon, which show that it doesn't have to be like that, or of the different states in the US and COVID, or of the adoption of solar power. Why do some places get it right and other places get it wrong? And it's because people make the decisions, the rules are put in place, and things improve. The map on plastics shows that you can remove the plastics just as you can put them there. And it's those before-after contrasts and the contrasts between the people acting, rules being put in place to fix problems, and those where it hasn't, that inspire me and give me a sense that actually we can learn by gaining these perspectives, and we can create a much better world for it.
Thank you so much, Ian, for a wonderful talk, a great evening. Thank you everyone who joined us this evening as well. Again, you can follow Ian on social media at Ian_Goldin, or find him at iangoldin.org. And thank you all again for joining us. And
thanks to you. It's really been great, and I appreciate you all participating in the call and how to arranging it. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a great evening.